It's time to talk about the fourth agreement. This one is a really interesting way to sort of think about life and what it means when you evaluate what is your best. So the agreement is written, always do your best, but I feel like we need to dig a little deeper than that. First of all, you have to recognize that your best is going to change from day to day, depending on a variety of circumstances. How you feel, how much sleep you've had, are you hungry? Are there things about your day that may not be going the way that you want them to go? And if that is the case, your best is sort of a moving thing. Some days it's going to show up one way. Other days it's going to show up a different way. And so part of it is about learning how to have self-compassion with yourself, to be able to say, okay, my best is going to change from day to day. And if I can learn to sort of ride with that, to roll with it, so to speak, and to recognize that I don't always have to hold myself to the same standard day after day after day after day. Sometimes this shows up when people have a very perfectionistic way of thinking, which honestly, that's a whole other conversation, but just something to think about, that if you're holding yourself to a standard of perfection and you determine that every single day you must show up at the same level of best, you're probably going to feel really at odds with yourself. Okay, now when this applies to other people, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, when you're looking at someone else's level of best, we have to start evaluating it through their level of best, not your own level of best. And I feel like that is like the hardest part of this whole agreement. Like on some level we think, okay, it's easy to give ourselves compassion, or at least we can start to be aware of it. But when we're asked to evaluate someone else's behavior by their standard, not our own, it brings up a certain amount of frustration, because we all have an idea of how things should be done, what we want to see happen, how we want the world to unfold around us. And when other people don't conform to our idea, it can really get complicated and sometimes toxic, depending on how it shows up. A great example of this that maybe isn't so much about romantic relationships, but just recognizing this concept of everyone showing up at a different level of best every day, is the idea of, okay, let's say you're driving down the road in traffic and someone cuts you off. It's really like human nature to want to be like, oh, I'm so frustrated, and, have whatever, frustrating feelings come from that. What would it be like for you to pause and reevaluate that maybe that was their best in that moment? Maybe they didn't see you. Maybe they just got some horrible news and they're on their way somewhere and they weren't paying attention as much as they should have. Maybe they've just had like a really bad day and they were in a hurry to get home. Regardless of the reason, it's more about how you then react to the situation. Are you holding them to your level of best, that you wouldn't cut someone off, so why did they? Or are you able to recognize that, again, going back to that agreement that don't take it personally, this is how they overlap. If you recognize it's their level of best and you stop taking it personally when someone does something that you don't like or don't enjoy, how does that change things? Okay, so then this shows up a lot in romantic relationships, where maybe you have an expectation of how a chore is supposed to get done. Or maybe you say, hey, can you do this, this, and this by the time I get home from work? And when you get home, maybe they've only done one of the things on your list of requests. Rather than automatically assuming that they didn't want to do what you asked, they're trying to hurt you or upset you or make you mad or frustrated, is it possible that there are some other elements to evaluate in the situation to try and understand what is their level of best in that moment? Maybe they got home and the dog had had an accident in the floor. So what they were going to spend time doing on your list ended up being something that they had to take care of right in that moment, which took away some of the time that they might have been able to spend on the tasks that you asked for. Now, this is not to say that it's always easy to figure out, right? I laid out a pretty simple example there. Sometimes it takes a good amount of work to really dig into what's beneath the surface and to allow your significant other to have some leniency. Now, this is not an excuse for laziness. This is not an excuse to just not do things or not support one another. But we do have to put it through the filter that sometimes our own level of best is not necessarily what our partner is going going to live by, adhere to, or even agree with. It doesn't mean that either of you is right or wrong, but it simply means that a renegotiation of those terms has to be looked at. And that is where things like courageous conversation and active listening, developing healthy levels of communication and comprehension and understanding becomes really, really important. We are going to keep talking about the 4 agreements. In the meantime, I will put a link to my free relationship communication guide in the description of this video. It goes into more details about how to actually have those healthy communication patterns that I'm talking about. And then we are going to keep talking not only about the 4 agreements, but there's also a 5th agreement. So you'll want to check back next week because that's when we're going to dig into the 5th agreement and how it shows up and interplays with all the 4 we've talked about so far.